What if I told you 4 teenage girls closing up a yogurt shop on a Friday night were bound with their own clothing, shot execution style, and then the killer set the building on fire to destroy the evidence? And it would take 34 years to find him.
That is, I mean, that's the absolute core of the Austin yogurt shop murders. December 6, 1991. It wasn't just a horrific night for 4 families.
Right.
It completely shattered Austin's reputation as this safe, kind of laid-back city. It changed things forever. And the investigation, right from the start, it just spiraled into this chaotic, decades-long nightmare.
A nightmare is the right word for it.
It was a maze of thousands of tips, something like 50, maybe more, false confessions, and then, tragically, a decade where innocent men were wrongly convicted. Some were even sent to death row.
The cost of that night is just...
Yeah.
It's almost unimaginable. You have the immediate violence, and then you have this horribly delayed justice. On December 6, 1991, firefighters, they get a call about a blaze at an, I can't believe it's yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane. And when they get inside, they discover 4 bodies. 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison, her 15-year-old sister Sarah, 17-year-old Eliza Thomas, and 13-year-old Amy Ayers. All 4 shot in the head. 3 of them had been sexually assaulted.
And what makes this case so compelling but also deeply disturbing is how that search for the truth became its own ordeal. I mean, it lasted for decades and was just marked by these profound systemic failures.
War of the failure.
We're talking about innocent men who lost the absolute prime of their lives, locked up in prison, all while a multi-state serial predator was, for all intents and purposes, hiding in plain sight.
And yet, amidst all of that darkness, all that institutional failure, there is this, I don't know, this powerful, almost heroic resolution to the story. And it all depends on the final act of the youngest victim, 13-year-old Amy Ayers.
It's incredible.
It was the DNA evidence under her fingernails. That was the definitive key that was needed to finally crack the case 3 decades later. So this isn't just a story about a cold case getting solved.
No, it's so much more.
It's about innocent men sent to death row, a serial killer who just crossed state lines, killing at will, and really the ultimate triumph of perseverance in modern forensic science.
It's a story where the evidence itself, it literally fought back.
Welcome to Whispers of Crime. Today we're going to be looking at the yogurt shop murders, examining the devastating crime, the failures of the legal system, and the scientific breakthroughs that finally brought, well, maybe not closure, but at least truth to this 34-year saga.
And this story, it forces us to confront some really uncomfortable questions about things like confirmation bias, police ethics, and the sometimes just agonizingly slow pace of real justice.
Subscribe to Whispers of Crime on YouTube. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and other podcast platforms. So let's start on that catastrophic night, December 6, 1991. It's a Friday. That I can't believe it's yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane is just winding down. They're getting ready to close at 11:00 p.m.
Completely routine. Or it should have been.
Exactly. Can you set the scene for us? Who were these girls and why were they all there that night?
Well, the location itself was, I mean, it was completely mundane, just a typical neighborhood hangout. Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas, both 17, they were the employees on shift responsible for closing up.
Okay, so they work there.
Right. And Jennifer's younger sister, Sarah, she was 15, and her friend, Amy Ayers, who was only 13, they were just there to hang out, to get a ride home with Jennifer after she was done.
Just kids waiting for a ride.
That's all it was. It was a place of, teenage innocence. And then in an instant, it became the site of just unimaginable horror.
And some of the sources suggest that this attack, as brutal as it was, wasn't just some stir-of-the-moment thing. It seems like it might have been premeditated.
Yeah.
What kind of suspicious details did investigators piece together about that last hour before 11 p.m.?
Yeah, that's a really critical point. The organization of the crime just screams planning. Investigators found out that about an hour before closing, a man had asked to use the public restroom in the back of the shop. And the immediate theory, which really fits the pattern of the killer they eventually identified, was that this was a kind of reconnaissance move. He might have used that time to, say, tamper with a lock or jam a rear door open.
So he could get back in later.
Exactly. To ensure he, or maybe an accomplice, could get in easily after the front doors were locked and the shop was secured.
And there were eyewitnesses too, right? People who noticed something felt off just before the doors were locked for the night.
Precisely. A couple who were the very last paying customers to leave the shop. They reported seeing 2 unidentified men sitting at one of the tables.
Two men.
Two men. And they described them as acting furtively. They were quiet, maybe avoiding eye contact, and they just seemed to be waiting for the last customers to leave.
Like they were watching the place.
It suggested they might have been doing surveillance or waiting for a signal. And that detail, the two furtive men, that becomes a huge point of confusion, a point of contention that honestly lasts for decades.
So the fire gets reported by a patrolman just before midnight. Once it's out, the grim reality of that scene starts to come into focus. Can you tell us about what they found? The state of the victims and the calculated brutality of the whole thing.
The fire department got the blaze under control pretty quickly, but the discovery inside was horrific. They found 4 nude bodies in the rear storage area of the shop, and the attack was systematic. It was controlled.
Not chaotic.
Not at all. All 4 girls had been bound, gagged, and shot in the head. It's what investigators immediately called an execution-style killing. This was methodical violence. It was designed to ensure there was no resistance, no noise, just a silent, rapid death.
And that level of control.
Yeah.
It suggests extreme organization, doesn't it?
Right.
Especially the detail about the bindings. They were tied with their own clothing, their own underwear. Did the early detectives immediately think this wasn't some frenzied, opportunistic attack?
Yes, absolutely. That detail was chilling, but it was also highly significant for profiling. The original investigative team, including a retired detective named John Jones, they profiled the killer, or killers, as being highly controlled, experienced, and almost certainly adult males.
Not teenagers.
Definitely not teenagers.
Yeah.
Using a victim's own clothing as restraints is a classic control mechanism. It maximizes the violation, the personal domination. It just strongly argued against some unplanned attack by panicked kids. And then you have the weapons.
Right, there were 2 guns.
2 guns, which complicated everything. A .22 caliber firearm and a .380 pistol. The immediate implication was that there were 2 perpetrators, each using a separate weapon. And that just reinforced the profile of organized criminals.
And on top of all that, the arson.
Yeah.
The crime scene was actively sabotaged. They used lighter fluid, and then you have the fire department's response.
Oh.
What was the magnitude of the forensic disaster this created?
It was almost total. I mean, the deliberate use of arson, dousing the area in lighter fluid and setting it on fire, that was obviously an attempt to destroy physical evidence, fingerprints, biological material, shoe prints, anything.
And the water didn't help.
The water made it so much worse. The automatic sprinklers kicked on immediately, and then the fire hoses pumped just massive amounts of water into the building. All that water severely compromised or just washed away potential evidence. It mixed blood, fluids, soot. Detective Jones described it as trying to work in a mud pit.
So things like fingerprinting would be
almost impossible. Standard techniques like latent fingerprinting were extraordinarily difficult because every single surface was coated in smoke, soot, and water.
So from the very beginning, the investigation was handicapped. They were leaning away from robust physical evidence and unfortunately paving the way for a reliance on much shakier human testimony later on.
That's exactly it. When physical evidence is compromised, police are forced to rely heavily on tips, interviews, and confessions, and that's where you introduce significant human error, potential for bias. That lack of solid physical evidence, despite the biological material that later became so crucial, that is the original sin of this case.
Before we move on to the devastating turns in the investigation, let's just pause and remember the girls who were lost. What do we know about Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy as people?
They're just kids, just starting their lives. Eliza Thomas, 17, she was a big animal lover, a very responsible employee. She was active in the FFA, the Future Farmers of America. She was actually raising a pig for a local livestock show at the time.
Wow. And Jennifer Harbison, also 17?
Jennifer was a high school senior. She was known for being a leader, and this is just heartbreaking, for being fiercely protective of her younger sister, Sarah.
And Sarah was there with her.
Sarah was 15, a freshman. She was into sports and clubs. She was just there that night, hanging out, waiting for her big sister to give her a ride home. And then there's Amy Ayers.
The youngest.
13 years old, the youngest victim. She was an avid horse lover, and her physical location in that back room, she was found separate from the others, and her body wasn't as severely charred. That meant that the evidence she left behind, it would become the single most important factor in solving this case 34 years later.
For final struggle.
The sources all suggest her determination to fight back was the key. Her final struggle left the only evidence that was capable of surviving the fire, the water, and all the institutional failure that was about to follow.
And this is where the investigation takes just a devastating turn. It moves from the challenge of a ruined crime scene to the catastrophic mistake of tunnel vision. In the immediate aftermath, thousands of tips flooded in. You said over 50 false confessions. It must have been chaos.
The city was terrified, and the police were under immense pressure to get a result and get one quickly. And amidst all that noise, you had some truly bizarre leads. There was even a serial killer, Kenneth McDuff, who confessed on the day of his own execution.
But that was a game.
It turned out to be just one of his final manipulative games. The police, though, they very quickly focused their attention on a group of local teenagers.
And that focus zeroed in on 16-year-old Maurice Pierce, just 8 days after the murders. Why him? What led them to him so fast?
It was a really startling piece of circumstance. Pierce was arrested at the North Cross Mall, which is right near the yogurt shop, for carrying a .22 caliber weapon.
The same caliber as one of the murder weapons.
The same make and model. So, under intense police scrutiny, Pierce confessed after hours and hours of interrogation by a detective, Hector Polanco. And in that confession, he implicated 3 of his acquaintances, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, and Forrest Wellborn.
But the confession itself, it was immediately suspect, wasn't it?
It was a massive red flag from the start. Detective John Jones, one of the original, more seasoned investigators, he interviewed Pierce the morning after his confession, and he realized immediately that the story Pierce was telling did not match the crime scene details at all.
So is it inconsistent?
Completely. And the ballistics testing on the .22 that Pierce was carrying, it was also inconclusive. They couldn't definitively link it to the crime. So because of all these inconsistencies, Detective Jones initially dismissed Pierce and the 3 others he implicated. He didn't see them as credible suspects.
Okay, let's talk about Detective Polanco's role here, because the source material mentions he was involved in another very notorious case involving coerced confessions.
This is a critical point of institutional failure that just haunts this entire case. Detective Polanco was the key detective who got that first inconsistent confession from Pierce. And previously, yes, he was centrally involved in the case against Christopher Ochoa and Richard Danziger.
And what happened in that case?
Those men were coerced into confessing to a murder they didn't commit. They served 13 years in prison and were later exonerated by DNA evidence. Tragically, Danziger suffered severe brain damage after being assaulted in prison.
So the fact that a detective with a documented history of getting false confessions was integral to this initial flawed lead, this should have been a screaming red flag to the entire department.
It should have been. It should have told them they needed to proceed with extreme caution, with really high verification standards. But that's not what happened.
So the case then goes cold for 8 long years.
Mm-hmm.
The original team moves on, but in 1999, a new task force reopens the investigation, and they completely disregard the original dismissal of those 4 teenagers.
It's like they started from a conclusion and worked backwards. The new task force decided that the original team had just failed to follow through. They somehow convinced themselves that these 4 young men who were now in their early 20s were the killers, and so they arrested Maurice Pierce, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, and Forrest Wellborn for capital murder.
And this time, after days of more interrogation, Springsteen and Scott both confessed. They implicated each other, and that basically handed the prosecution their entire case on a silver platter.
That is absolutely correct. The confessions of Springsteen and Scott were the prosecution's entire foundation. They had no physical evidence, none. Nothing linking any of the 4 men to that crime scene, no matching DNA, no fingerprints, no physical trace whatsoever.
But they still got convictions.
They did. Springsteen was convicted in 2001 and sentenced to death. That was later commuted to life since he was only 17 at the time of the crime. And Michael Scott was convicted in 2002 and sentenced to life imprisonment.
And what happened to the other 2 guys from that group, Wellborn and Pierce?
Forrest Wellborn was cleared pretty quickly. He was no-billed by a grand jury, which means the grand jury looked at the evidence and just declined to issue a formal indictment. So all charges against him were dropped. And the charges against Maurice Pierce were eventually dropped too for lack of credible evidence. The state's entire focus was on the 2 men who had confessed.
The methods they used to get those confessions from Scott and Springsteen, I mean, that's the real heart of the systemic failure in this case, isn't it? The descriptions are they're horrifying.
The methods were confirmed to be profoundly unethical, manipulative, and they were clearly designed not to find the truth, but simply to obtain a conviction. Michael Scott was questioned over 4 grueling days. He endured 18 hours of interrogation before he finally broke and confessed.
18 hours.
18 hours. Robert Springsteen was questioned for 5 hours, and the detectives used all these known manipulative tactics, sleep deprivation, promising them reduced sentences, and actively lying to them, saying things like, "The others have already implicated you. Your only chance is to cooperate."
That's all standard. If morally questionable, police strategy. But the physical intimidation of Michael Scott goes so far beyond questionable. It's criminal.
It is the one detail that is just utterly indefensible, and it shows a complete breakdown of ethical policing. Detectives admitted under oath that during Michael Scott's interrogation, an officer held a loaded .22 caliber pistol to his head. He placed his finger on the back of Scott's scalp.
I can't even imagine that.
And when Scott, who was understandably terrified, said, "You scared the shit out of me," the officer's response was a chilling confirmation of intent. He said that was the purpose, to scare the shit out of him.
That is not an interrogation. That's torture. It's an abuse of power that resulted in a decade of lost life for an innocent man. How could confessions obtained under that kind of duress ever stand up in court?
Well, ultimately, they did not. Between 2006 and 2009, the convictions were systematically overturned. Though, interestingly, it was initially on procedural grounds that were related to the use of those same confessions.
What was the legal principle?
It was a violation of the Sixth Amendment's Confrontation Clause, and it was heavily influenced by a 2004 Supreme Court ruling in a case called Crawford v. Washington.
Okay, for those of us who aren't lawyers, can you simplify what Crawford v. Washington meant for this case?
Certainly. So because Springsteen and Scott were tried separately, neither one could be forced to testify against the other. The prosecution, however, used edited or redacted portions of Scott's confession in Springsteen's trial to try and back up their theory of guilt.
So they were using one confession against the other man, even though he couldn't question him.
Precisely. The Crawford ruling essentially said that testimonial statements, like confessions, from a person who does not appear in court cannot be used against a defendant unless that defendant had a prior opportunity to cross-examine them. The court decided that even with parts blacked out, the redacted confessions still clearly incriminated the other defendant, and that violated their constitutional right to confront their accuser.
So the convictions get overturned because the confessions were unreliable and used improperly. But what was the thing that truly confirmed their factual innocence?
That's where science finally came in. The Travis County District Attorney's Office, under Rosemary Lemberg, they still intended to retry the men. But first, they ordered advanced DNA testing on the preserved vaginal swabs that had been taken from one of the victims back in 1991. Specifically, they used something called YSTR DNA testing.
Okay, what is YSTR testing, and why was it the right tool here?
YSTR stands for Y chromosome short tandem repeats. It's a very specialized form of DNA analysis that only looks at the male Y chromosome, which is inherited exclusively from father to son.
So it filters out female DNA.
Exactly. It's incredibly useful in sexual assault cases, where you often have a mixture of the victim's female DNA and the perpetrator's male DNA. The YSTR test just filters out all the female DNA and gives you a pure male profile. It makes it a highly accurate way to identify, or in this case, exclude male suspects.
And what did that conclusive scientific evidence reveal?
It proved definitively that the male DNA profile found on the victim did not match Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, or Forrest Wellborn. This exclusion was the irrefutable scientific evidence that forced the DA to dismiss all charges against Scott and Springsteen in October of 2009. In fact, 7 jurors from the original trials later stated publicly that they would never have convicted the men if this DNA evidence had been presented.
They were free, finally. After nearly a decade behind bars, ripped from their lives based on lies and intimidation. But even then, the system handed them one last profound injustice, didn't it?
Yes. The failure continued right up to the moment they walked out of prison. Because their convictions were overturned based on that constitutional error, that Sixth Amendment violation, and not a formal judicial finding of actual innocence, Scott and Springsteen were initially denied state compensation.
That distinction just feels like a kind of bureaucratic cruelty. How much money were they denied?
It was substantial, and it was critical for them to try and rebuild their lives. At the time, Texas law offered compensation of up to $80,000 for each year served, plus a lifetime annuity.
So for them, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars each.
At least. Money they desperately needed for housing, education, medical care after a decade of lost time and lost earnings. They were released, but they were left financially broken, still having to fight for years to be recognized as innocent victims of the state, all because of a legal loophole.
The state was quick to use coercion, but so slow to admit its mistake.
Incredibly resistant to acknowledge and compensate for that profound miscarriage of justice. It's a painful reminder that freedom doesn't always equal justice.
It's a secondary tragedy of this whole case that must never be forgotten.
Absolutely.
We'll be right back with the scientific breakthrough that finally revealed the identity of the true monster. Subscribe on YouTube and follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker. Like, share, comment, and drop your review and rating.
Sure.
So after the exonerations in 2009, the case goes truly cold again. The only real physical lead they have left is this pure YSTR profile of an unknown male killer. And for years, the identity of that person remained a complete mystery.
Right. The focus shifted entirely to that DNA sample. How could they maximize its potential? And the years that followed were really defined by investigators trying to catch up to the rapidly evolving science of DNA analysis. It was a period filled with a lot of hope, but also, unfortunately, a lot of repeated disappointment.
I remember the news coverage around 2017. There was a huge amount of buzz that they had nearly solved it using new genetic techniques. What happened with that? It seemed so close.
It was an extremely frustrating moment for everyone involved. In 2017, an investigator used an early form of what we now call investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG. They searched a public online DNA database.
And they found something.
They found what looked like a partial match to an FBI-uploaded profile. It looked like a massive lead, but the match was incomplete. It only had 16 genetic markers, which is just not robust enough for a definitive ID. And on top of that, because of privacy concerns with the public database, the FBI initially refused to release the individual's name.
So they had a whisper of a name, but no legal way to follow up, and the science wasn't quite there yet.
Exactly. It was a legal and a scientific bottleneck. Congressman Michael McCall, he pressed the FBI really hard to collaborate, and they finally agreed to work with Austin PD to try more advanced testing in 2020 to try and develop more markers from the original evidence. It delivered the worst possible news. While they did raise the marker count to 25, several of the new markers did not align with that original FBI sample, so that individual was conclusively excluded.
The breakthrough just evaporated.
Completely. And the case went right back into the deep freeze.
That level of setback after almost 30 years of waiting must have just been demoralizing. But then we have to introduce Detective Daniel Jackson. He takes over the cold case in 2022. And he comes in with a renewed commitment to leverage the absolute cutting edge of forensic science, especially advanced IgG.
Detective Jackson understood that the only way forward was to be strategic and to be persistent. Let's be clear about what IgG is now. It's the process of uploading unknown DNA profiles to specialized public databases to find distant relatives of a suspect.
And that you build family trees.
Right. Forensic genealogists use traditional genealogy methods, building family trees forward and backward, to narrow down suspects from those relatives. Jackson's team committed to using this, but they didn't just rely on DNA.
And the first definitive break in decades came not from the DNA, but from a piece of physical evidence that had been sitting in an evidence locker for 30-plus years. This is June of 2025.
This is where that persistence really paid off. Detective Jackson's team resubmitted a critical piece of evidence, a .380 cartridge casing that had been found in a drain at the crime scene all those years ago, and they ran it through the NIBIN system.
Okay, NIBIN. Let's pause and define that for our listeners. What does NIBIN do?
NIBIN stands for the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. It's a computerized system run by the ATF that captures and compares these high-resolution images of the unique microscopic markings left on shell casings and bullets after a gun is fired.
Like a fingerprint for a gun.
It's exactly like a fingerprint for a gun. NIBIN allows law enforcement to match ballistics from a crime scene in, say, Texas, to ballistics from unsolved crimes all across the country.
And in 2025, that old casing, run through new and improved technology, finally got a match.
A huge one. It generated a hit that linked the Austin casing to a completely separate, unsolved 1998 murder case in Kentucky. The victim was a woman named Linda Rutledge. This was the first definitive proof that the yogurt shop killer wasn't some local offender. He was a serial predator operating across state lines.
The .380 was a serial firearm.
It was.
So once they had that connection to the Kentucky case, how did they finally close the loop with the DNA? This is August 2025.
Detective Jackson went back to that original YSTR DNA profile. Knowing now that the killer was a transient serial offender, He requested a specialized manual YSTR search from all the state labs across the U.S. that maintain these profiles, not just the main Cordis system.
And he got a hit.
The South Carolina State Lab found the key, a complete 27 allele YSTR match. This match linked the unknown yogurt shop profile to a known male profile from a 1990 sexual assault and murder case in Greenville, South Carolina.
So you have two simultaneous, irrefutable hits, one from ballistics, one from DNA, and they're both pointing to the same person. The perpetrator was finally identified.
The profile belonged to a man named Robert Eugene Brashers, born in 1958. On September 26, 2025, Austin police formally announced Brashers as the perpetrator, and immediately, his status as a multi-state predator active across the South and Midwest for over a decade was established.
Tell us about the full scope of Brasher's crimes, because this brings the original detective's profile of an experienced adult criminal tragically, horrifyingly into focus.
Brasher's history is just a map of brutality. It included a conviction for attempted murder in Florida way back in 1985. The DNA linked him to the 1990 murder and rape of Genevieve Zitricki in South Carolina. The ballistics linked him to the 1998 murder of Linda Rutledge in Kentucky. And a combination of DNA and ballistics linked him to the 1998 double murder and rape of Sherry Scherer and her 12-year-old daughter, Megan Scherer, in Portageville, Missouri.
A mother and her child. Oh my God. His modus operandi seems to align perfectly with the Austin crime, which resolves all the confusion created by those false confessions from the teenagers.
It was a perfect match for that original profile. Brashers consistently acted alone, but he used multiple weapons. He specialized in sexual assault and dominating his victims by binding them, often using their own clothing for restraints, exactly what happened in Austin. He was the organized, transient serial killer the original investigators had suspected from day one.
And the final piece of evidence, the smoking gun, literally was confirmed through ballistics.
Yes. The .380 pistol Brashers used to commit suicide in 1999 during a police standoff over a completely unrelated vehicle theft in Missouri was definitively proven by Nibbin to be the same weapon used to shoot at least one of the victims at the yogurt shop. It closed the physical evidence loop completely.
And the timeline proves he fled Austin immediately after the murders.
Crucially, less than 48 hours after the Austin murders, on December 8, 1991, Brashers was stopped by Border Patrol in West Texas. He was driving a stolen car and, most damningly, he was in possession of that very same .380 pistol.
And they let him go.
He escaped detection at the time, but the evidence of his immediate flight was always there, buried in a file.
Which brings us back to the most powerful and the most emotional moment of resolution in this entire 34-year story. The DNA found under 13-year-old Amy Ayer's fingernails.
That is the ultimate act of courage and persistence. The DNA evidence under Amy Ayer's nails confirmed to be a complete 27 allele match to Brashers. It definitively proved that she fought back against her killer in her final moments.
It hit him.
She did. Detective Jackson noted that this tiny piece of genetic material, which survived the fire and the water, there was a 2.5 million to 1 likelihood it belonged to Brashers, was the ultimate key to solving the case. It was the only piece of evidence left by the monster that could not be destroyed or compromised by human error.
So Robert Eugene Brashers was the killer. The monster was identified by science, but in a final twist of profound historical injustice, he died by suicide in 1999. He never faced a courtroom for the yogurt shop murders or for the full horrific extent of his killing spree.
He died nearly 26 years before the truth was revealed, while 2 innocent men were still locked in a prison cell for his crimes. The truth was finally found, but the justice system's ability to hold him accountable, that was interrupted forever.
So reflecting on this resolution, finally coming in 2025, after 34 years, the costs are just staggering. 4 young lives lost, and nearly 10 years of life stolen from Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, all due to this cascade of investigative failures, from tunnel vision to the coercive tactics rooted in Detective Polanco's history.
The layers of tragedy are just immense. You have the anguish of the families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, who had to endure decades of uncertainty and watch the wrong men be accused and convicted. And then you have the profound trauma inflicted upon Scott and Springsteen.
A gun to the head.
A literal gun held to one's head, just to construct a narrative that fit a fatally flawed theory. The system failed every single person involved in this case.
But the scientific certainty that the 2025 identification of Brashers provides, that finally gives them a mechanism for true legal redress, doesn't it? What does this mean for Scott and Springsteen now?
The formal announcement that Brashers was the sole source of the male DNA and the perpetrator, that officially and scientifically exonerates the original four suspects. And critically, Travis County District Attorney Jose Garza publicly acknowledged that the overwhelming weight of the evidence points to the guilt of one man and to the innocence of four.
And that statement is key.
It's everything. That declaration removes the legal distinction that previously denied them compensation. It opens a new, vital legal pathway for Scott and Springsteen to finally receive the full state restitution, that up to $80,000 per year served, that they were wrongfully denied for all these years because they were freed on a constitutional error instead of actual innocence.
That formal correction of the record, confirming the state imprisoned innocent men while the true killer walked free, that's probably the only genuine legal justice that's achievable for them at this point.
It is the moment of final institutional acknowledgement. It proves that the investigative system prioritized a conviction based on a coerced confession over the facts that were suggested by the physical evidence. And that's a mistake that cost two innocent men a decade of their lives.
And yet, despite this comprehensive resolution by DNA and ballistics, there is still one persistent discrepancy from the source material that the authorities seem to have dismissed. But it raises an important question. It complicates the lone killer theory.
That is the enduring shadow mystery of the two men. You have to remember, eyewitnesses consistently describe seeing two men sitting in that booth at the yogurt shop, acting furtively just before closing time.
But the official story now is that Brashers acted alone.
Right. In 2025, authorities stated definitively that there is no DNA, no physical evidence of an accomplice. That leads them to believe Brashers acted entirely alone.
But the ballistics showed two different guns were used, a .22 and a .380.
And that is the unavoidable tension right at the end of this. While Brashers certainly could have carried and fired both weapons himself, that's consistent with some organized serial killers, the simultaneous use of two distinct firearms, coupled with that consistent eyewitness testimony of two men, it forces us to leave that question open.
So were the two men just a massive red herring that derailed the investigation from the very start?
That's one possibility. Or was there a second perpetrator? Someone involved in binding and controlling the victims who perhaps just didn't leave any traceable DNA and remains untraceable, still walking free 34 years later. It's the final unresolved shadow hanging over a case otherwise solved by forensic science.
I think the ultimate takeaway from this difficult story has to be the sheer grinding perseverance of the victims' families and the dedicated investigators, like Detective Jackson, who just refused to let scientific leads stagnate. This case is a reminder that while justice is often delayed, the continuous evolution of forensic science can provide the tools to triumph over both human error and deep cruelty.
And that triumph rests in large part on the courage of 13-year-old Amy Ayers. Her final, desperate struggle provided the definitive, uncorrupted genetic evidence that finally exposed her killer. And in doing so, she secured the truth for all four girls and the exoneration of two wrongly convicted men. We have to remember that, as the mother of Amy Ayers has said, closure may not exist in a case this painful. But the truth finally does.
Thank you for joining us as we explored the case of the Yogurt Shop murders. Subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker. Like, share, comment. Please give us your review and rating.